This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Jeff Whitworth, Extension Field Crop Entomologist, begins the show with information about chinch bugs. Now is the time that producers should be checking their fields and thinking about when they are planting sorghum. A discussion about summer pneumonia with Gregg Hanzlicek, Director of Production Animal Field Investigations in the Diagnostic Lab at K-State, continues today's show. It is a fairly new respiratory disease that impacts calves. We also hear from the USDA as Manhattan, Kansas has recently welcomed the National Bio and Agro-Defense facility. Wrapping up today's show is K-State Nursery Crop and Marketing Specialist Cheryl Boyer as she provides tips for choosing the best potting media for outdoor use. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we're talking now about chinch bugs. And to discuss that topic, we have K-State Extension Field Crop Entomologist Jeff Whitworth. So what is a chinch bug?
Chinch bugs are serious pests and have been serious pests for many, many years. They're true bugs, and the importance of that is twofold as far as pest control goes. Number one, they suck plants. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts, so they suck the juice out of the plant. And the second consideration is true bugs have kind of a waxy coating. So insecticides generally are not absorbed as easily or as well as they are with some of the other insects. So sometimes it takes a little longer to kill them, or it's a little more difficult to kill with traditional insecticides that are, contact insecticides. The most I ever remember chinch bugs was 1980 when we had just finished my PhD. It was a really dry year. I think we had the most 100-degree days in a row of ever. And we were out looking for chinch bugs, and chinch bugs were everywhere. And they were just killing everything that was a grass, corn, sorghum, everything. So I compare everything back to 1980. 2023, right now, this time of year, first part of June, looks like we may have another year comparable to 1980. Now, again, that's going to depend upon the weather a little bit. And I say that because we have some drought conditions. If we get out of this drought, I think it will help chinch bug problem. But chinch bugs, right now, they're in the wheat. They've overwintered in bunch grasses. 2 months ago, when the wheat broke dormancy and started growing, the adult chinch bugs moved out of where they were overwintering, and they moved into the wheat. And then the wheat, as it grows, they started feeding on that a little bit. Now, as the wheat starts to senesce or dry down or, turn yellow, gold, whatever you want to call it, the chinch bugs, they've laid their eggs. The eggs are just now hatching, and the little nymphs cannot fly. That's an important fact to remember. The nymphs cannot fly. The adults can fly, but the nymphs are the ones that are going to cause the problems. They're in the wheat. They're still feeding in the wheat as long as there's a little bit of green left in the wheat. But as it senesces, as it dries down, remember I said chinch bugs suck the juice out of plants. As that juice dries, they're going to be looking for food. They start moving out of the wheat, and if you plant sorghum, corn, or any grass adjacent to wheat, you could have a problem early on as those plants germinate. Now, one of the easy ways to determine if you could have a problem or not is get out and sample in your wheat right now. Just as it starts to turn yellow, you can go out and sample in several different places on the side of the field that you're considering planting sorghum or corn into. If you take a 1 square foot sample, and by that I just walk out in the field and take my foot's about 12 inches, and do that in 4 places, get down on your hands and knees and see if there's any chinch bugs in that little square that you've pushed the weed out of the way. Now, they're difficult to see because they will be down in the ground, but you can see them. If you have 1 chinch bug in any of those square foot samples, that indicates that you're going to have a chinch bug problem if you plant sorghum adjacent to that wheat field. That, by chinch bug problem, I mean they're going to be moving out en masse. Remember, you just did a 1 foot sample, and in that 1 foot, you found 1 chinch bug. So think how many square feet there are in that field, and all those chinch bugs are going to be moving out because they're losing their succulent wheat, and they're going to be looking for someplace else to suck the juice out of. So if you plant sorghum, and if that sorghum is germinating within the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, those chinch bugs will be moving out. And for everybody that's grown sorghum in the last 20 years in Kansas, chinch bugs can be a real problem. And the question I always get, what about treated seed. Do seed treatments protect against chinch bugs? The insecticide-treated seed works really well. The problem with that is the chinch bug. Remember I said chinch bugs are piercing, sucking insects. So they have to suck a little bit of the juice out of the plant in order to get the toxin. It will kill them, but they still have to put a little wound in that plant and suck a little bit of the juice out. If you have enough chinch bugs doing that on enough plants, they will kill the plant. Even though the insecticide kills the chinch bugs, it still won't be enough to protect the plant. The nice thing about that is generally if you have treated seed, and I think a lot of the sorghum seed is treated nowadays, again, with an insecticide, I'm not talking fungicide, it will slow them down. So whereas if you did not use treated seed, you may lose 20 to 25 rows that are, adjacent to that field, whereas if you use treated seed, you may only lose 5 or 6 rows. So keep that in mind. But that seed treatment's only going to last 21 to 28 days. So if you plant now, or if you planted last week, you got 21 days from the time you planted until that insecticide has dissipated and is no longer effective. If those chinch bugs start boiling out of that wheat in that time, it will help slow them down. Do seed treatments work? They do work, but only for 21 to 28 days.
Besides seed treatment, what are some other controls that would work for hopefully not having chinch bugs in your field?
One of the common practices is what we call cultural control or varying your planting date. So if you planted 2 weeks ago, your sorghum may be knee-high. By the time the chinch bugs come out, they'll still feed on it, but it will be able to withstand more chinch bugs or more feeding damage. They still may do a number on it, but it will be able to withstand it a little longer. Or you can delay planting till after that migration has moved out by a week or two. The chinch bug nymphs, they have to find food within 2 or 3 days or they die. They're a walking generation, so if they walk 50 feet and find grass, they'll feed. Much more than that, if they don't find something to feed on, they're going to perish. So if you wait 2 weeks, they'll all be out of the wheat field. Once the wheat has senesced, turned yellow, turned golden, and all the chinch bugs have moved out, then you can plant wheat because it's 5 to 7 days before it germinates. You'll have missed, just avoided that chinch bug walking migration. So that's, in my opinion, a really good way of avoiding chinch bug damage. But a lot of folks, you got your own schedule. You got to do it when you got to do it, and I understand that. So the third way of doing it, if you don't use seed treatments or you can't vary your planting date, is by just a foliar insecticide. There are some foliar insecticides that work pretty well. Generally, you only have to spray maybe 1 or 2 passes, 4, 8, 12 rows on the side adjacent to the wheat. But what you want to do is make sure you use adequate water or carrier to get to where the chinch bugs are. These insecticides are contact insecticides, so they have to contact the bug in order to kill them. And remember what I said, they have a waxy coating, so it takes a little more or a little longer both to actually control them, but it will eventually control them. So those are the 3 keys to controlling chinch bugs. Once this walking migration is gone, that doesn't mean we're done with them, because those chinch bugs then will start feeding on corn, sorghum, yard, fescue, whatever, on any kind of a grass, and they will start developing and maturing until they become adults. Then that will start another generation. Those adults will fly around and lay eggs. That's a generation that's really tough to kill, because in sorghum and corn, they get behind the leaf sheath. And when they're behind the leaf sheath, it's really tough to get an insecticide to them. Remember, all the insecticides we're using are contact insecticides. So they have to contact the bug. They can't, it's not taken up by the plant systematically. It has to contact the bug. So if you're going to spray a month from now, you're going to have to use a lot of carrier, a lot of water to make sure you get it down to the base of the plant. Use drop nozzles, that spray on both sides of the plant as you go. And that's a tough time to treat them. Another consideration is moisture. If we have a lot of rain, if we have good moisture, the plants can withstand a lot more chinch bug feeding than if it's stressed. Under drought conditions, especially in going into July and August, if we have our normal drought, you got a lot of chinch bugs feeding. They will actually suck the juice out of the plant. It reduces yield, and it can cause the plants to, the stems, stalks, whatever you call them, to dry down, and they will actually fall over. So chinch bugs are a real problem. They have been, and they're not going away, but They're just in the wheat right now. They haven't come out and gotten into the sorghum and or corn. The reason I don't talk about corn much is because it's a little further along than sorghum. Even though they will get into corn, they just don't seem to affect it as much as the sorghum just because of the timing of the chinch bugs getting into it.
What does a chinch bug look like?
When they're first hatched, they're really tiny, really small, little pink, reddish color with a white stripe. As they get a little larger, they'll turn gray with a white stripe. And then as they become an adult, they are gray with kind of the white wings kind of look like a white X on their back. Sometimes they are confused with a false chinch bug, especially in soybeans. Chinch bugs mainly get into grasses, but in soybeans there's a false chinch bug that looks a lot like a chinch bug. Folks know what chinch bugs can do, so they worry about false chinch bugs in soybeans, but I've really never seen them cause a problem. I've seen them in enormous numbers on plants, but a week later they're gone and they haven't caused a problem. So the chinch bug right now, they're in the wheat. You can get out and sample if you're considering planting sorghum adjacent to a wheat field. I really recommend you get out and sample that wheat field. Otherwise, you need to take, hopefully, the recommendation of avoiding planting right now or 2 weeks or 3 weeks after they moved out, or do one of the management techniques we just discussed to try and mitigate some of the chinch bug damage.
Jeff, thank you for coming on and sharing some information about the chinch bug. I appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Now, if it rains, it will help a lot.
That was K-State Extension Field crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. If you would like to read more about the chinch bug, you can do so in the Crops, Insects in Kansas book, which will be linked in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we're going to talk about summer pneumonia, and to talk about that is Director of Production Animal Field Investigations in the Diagnostic Lab in the College of Veterinary Medicine at K-State, Gregg Hanzlicek. Greg, thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Talking about summer pneumonia, what is it?
Well, it's a relatively new phenomenon, and it's a respiratory disease syndrome that affects pre-weaning beef calves, and we started seeing this and talking about it probably 4 or 5 years ago, and the reason I wanted to kind of talk about it today is that we're seeing cases again this year. Started in April, and we just continue to see cases. So it's just a respiratory disease in pre-weaned calves.
We recently talked about cattle heat stress, so it's just kind of that time of year of things are coming back forward. And so what cattle are most likely to have issues with summer pneumonia?
Well, these are pre-weaned beef calves, and there's two syndromes we think we're seeing now. One is early in the spring, April, May, into June. And then there's another part of the syndrome where the respiratory disease shows up midway through the pasture season as we get closer to weaning. And so the early onset are calves in herds. Typically, they're well managed, and they're herds that usually have a history of bringing all the cows and all the calves into a confined area. And for synchronization, AI, maybe just working the calves. And what we're thinking is that these calves are being exposed to a very high load of the virus that is associated with this disease from the adults. And then when we kick them out in the pasture, then they break with the pneumonia. So that's the early one.
And you talked a little bit beforehand about the late one, and it's called coronavirus, but probably not what people think of when the coronavirus pops in their head.
That's right. So the early one is BRSV, bovine respiratory syncytial virus. The late one, which we see later in the season, it's a coronavirus, which most producers, I think, probably all know and dealt with it as a neonatal scours virus. This is genetically different than the scour virus, even though it is still a coronavirus.
Are there some major differences between these two syndromes?
That's a great question. Absolutely. So the BRSV, the early ones, the percentage of calves that become ill with the respiratory disease is kind of moderate, but the death loss can be relatively high. The coronavirus, the one later on, in most cases, almost every calf becomes sick, but a death is very, very rare. So it's two different organisms, and they affect the herd differently.
And kind of circling back, you mentioned that this is something that's really only come on in the past few years. And so is something just recently got named, or is just something that happened in our environment?
Well, we don't know. In the name, I'm using summer pneumonia. Another name we use is pasture pneumonia. I don't know if it has an official name, but we don't know what actually has brought it on, but it's definitely not something, when I was in practice 10 or 15 years ago, it's not something we dealt with. But today, it's relatively common.
And so if producers are concerned about this, as they probably should be, what are some ways they could mitigate creating this problem in their herd?
Well, number one is to get an appropriate diagnosis. So they're going to act like they have respiratory disease. They'll be breathing rapidly. They'll have fevers. They may want to find shade. But there's lots of other diseases besides respiratory diseases that'll mimic that. So number one, I'd have veterinarians examine them, let them listen to their lungs. And then if it's respiratory disease, there's a real simple nasal swab and a test that we can do in the laboratory that'll say what is the predominant organism that is associated with this respiratory outbreak. Those are the first steps.
And for producers, when they're working them, are there some things they should do to hopefully reduce the cattle-calf interaction?
Yeah, well, and it's a hard sell, but on the early onset, because we believe that getting everybody together in a confined area really sets it off. If producers can synchronize their AI or work calves in smaller groups so that not everybody's together, we think and we're pretty sure that will help prevent the issue. Now, that can't always be done. When we're talking about BRSV, which is the early one, there are really good nasal vaccines that have BRSV, so we recommend that producers also give those calves a intranasal vaccine at that time, and those intranasals they'll be effective in about 2 to 3 days, so it'll protect those calves very, very quickly. So that's what we recommend for early.
And if producers did the steps and tried to avoid it but still haven't connected with their vet, what should they do for testing purposes?
For both corona and the BRSV is that there's new technology out there where if we find the BRSV or the corona in the calf, we've got a catalog of genetics of these viruses, and we can compare what we're finding in the calf to the strains that are in the vaccines. And we know that in order to have good vaccine protection, the strains have to be closely related to what the calves are experiencing in the field. So it helps the producer and the veterinarian decide this vaccine matches the virus strain that I'm seeing in my herd. So it's really a pretty good way to decide what vaccine I need to use going forward.
So what are some key takeaways you'd like for cattle producers to know about summer pneumonia?
Well, number one, it's a syndrome. So just like everything else in bovine medicine, there's a lot of things that are interacting. We don't really understand it all. We do believe that it has something to do with getting calves exposure to lots of adults. I back up. I forgot to mention about the corona. In those herds, when we see it, a lot of those herds were on a marginal pre-calving nutrition program. And what we're thinking there is that the colostrum protection that those calves got was not great. And so their maternal antibodies are wearing off partway through the pasture season. And when that happens, then they're more predisposed to coming down with an illness.
So, Greg, we mentioned that you work at the Diagnostic lab, and so the lab tests more than just coronavirus and for BRSV. What scope does the lab have?
Well, we have 500 different tests, and I think the last time I looked, over 100 different species that they cover, everything from bovines to equines to cats and dogs to all kinds of exotics and zoo animals. So we have all the kind. We've got 13 different sections. So we've got pathologists, bacteriologists, toxicologists, microbiologists. We've got all the ologists in the laboratory. We're one of the largest in the United States. We're one of only a few laboratories that are actually accredited by a third party called the AAVLD that allows us to do specialized testing and make sure that our quality control and our quality assurance is where it should be.
Where can people find out information about how to send tests and if there is a test for what they're needing?
Well, go to our website, www.ksvdl.org, or they can call 866-512-5650, and somebody will help them.
Greg, I appreciate you coming in and giving us some information about summer pneumonia and then also filling us in a little bit about what the lab can do here at K-State. I appreciate it.
You bet. My pleasure.
That was the Director of Production Animal Field Investigations in the Diagnostic Lab in the College of Veterinary Medicine at K-State, Gregg Hanzlicek. The resources that he mentioned in today's show can be found in today's show notes on agtoday.net. At the end of May, the National Bio and Agro-Defense Facility came to fruition in Manhattan, Kansas. It's been an almost 2-decade process. Rod Bain reports with Secretary Tom Vilsack, Senator Jerry Moran, and former U.S. Senator Pat Roberts.
It was the culmination of a process well over 2 decades in the making.
The research that's going to be done here is, in fact, critically important to protect American agriculture.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack at the recent dedication ceremony of the National Bio and Agro-Defense Facility. NBAF, as it is known, began as a response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks of 2001. As U.S. Senator from Kansas Jerry Moran explains,
as a result, a commission was appointed by President Bush to make recommendations about what needed to be done to make America safe. It resulted in a presidential directive to develop a plan to provide safe, secure, and a state-of-the-art agricultural biocontainment capacity and capabilities for research and diagnostics.
The call for locating NBAF occurred in 2006, and after a very competitive process, site awardment was made to Manhattan, Kansas in 2009. Former U.S. Senator Pat Roberts was among those leading the efforts to locate the facility in his home state.
We still must be prepared for a threat that could have been disastrous over 20 years ago, and I believe still remains. It is so easy to do, and the consequences are so terribly severe, short and long term. And that is why we have NBAF.
Secretary Vilsack recalls the management arrangement agreed upon by USDA and the Department of Homeland Security and its then Secretary, Janet Napolitano.
She was anxious and interested to explore a partnership where DHS would be accepting responsibility for the construction of this great facility. But man, when the real work began, they'd like to transfer that responsibility to the Department of Agriculture.
The Agriculture Secretary and Kansas senators joined other dignitaries in groundbreaking ceremonies in 2015, reconvening this year for the dedication of NBAF. As mentioned earlier, USDA at that event took over management of the facility to be operated jointly by the Agricultural Research Service and Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. With it now in place, the National Bio and Agro-Defense Facility becomes the first in the nation with biosafety Level 4 containment capacity, allowing the housing of large livestock for study of potential animal disease threats. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
From the USDA, that was Rod Bain, Secretary Tom Vilsack, Senator Jerry Moran, and former U.S. Senator Pat Roberts. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. K-State horticulturist Ward Upham has had several questions this spring on choosing the best potting media. K-State nursery crop and marketing specialist Cheryl Boyer has done extensive studies on potting soils and recently contributed to the 3-part series for the weekly horticulture newsletter, which Ward publishes. Today, Cheryl covers some of the steps for making a good choice. Cheryl, you had an opportunity to do a 3-part series in the weekly horticulture newsletter that really focused on choosing potting media for outdoor use, and I know that's a question that a lot of people have, and the first step is just, what are you using that potting media for?
Yeah, so there's lots of different ways to think about the alternative, those bags of potting material that you see at the garden centers. Some of them are really more for landscape application, others are for containers. And you really need to think about what size of container you're using and what you're going to put in it. So potting media, there's lots of things that you can use to grow plants in. And it actually matters how big the particle sizes are and what they are composed of. But for a bigger container, you want bigger pieces because they'll break down over time. And for a small container, you want maybe something that has smaller pieces, but definitely has some components of water holding capacity so that, when it gets hot, there's still some resources in that container for the plants because their whole world is inside that pot. If there's not food, if there's not water, if there's not structure, then they will fail. But there are also some things to know about what not to put in a container, too, that will prevent some challenges.
Oh, you talked about reading the label, and I often think about like food labels, and we look for certain things. I'm assuming that's the same way when we're talking about potting?
Yeah, most people actually don't look, and it's kind of an interesting process to look and see what gets put in potting media. It's not as critical as what we eat, of course, but it does influence how your plants will perform in containers. So, for example, the probably the worst thing that you can put in a container is field soil. And there are quite a few materials that are just bagged field soil. And in a container, there's just not enough airspace, and it will tighten up like concrete and make it so plants really can't explore and get resources and nutrients that they need. And they'll really struggle in that kind of situation. But a lot of the other materials are sphagnum peat moss, which is generally mined in Canada for here. And there's different species, there's different sizes, there's different coarsenesses of it, or aged or broken down. Pine bark is a big one. There's also a difference between pine bark, which has a low pH, which, as you know, our soils in Kansas tend to be high in soil pH, which some plants struggle with. So if you can put those low pH items in the potting media, our water, which might actually be kind of alkaline or high in pH, will begin to balance that out a little bit and provide a neutral environment for plants. Hardwood bark, on the other hand, is a little bit different and tends to be higher in pH. And a lot of materials have that. It doesn't break down quite as quickly as some of the other materials. There's lots of different things that you might see in a potting media. Many of them will promote that they're organic, but most of them are organic by nature. They just may or may not have gone through the organic certification process. But it's hard to go wrong with a lot of the potting medias that we have, and they come in different sizes of bags, different price ranges. There's lots to choose from. But in general, you want to look for mixes that are pine bark based if you can, just because it helps us mitigate our soil pH and our water pH challenges. And often they'll have some peat moss mixed in too, and that's a nice mix. Before I forget, I want to add there are some things that you want to look for in terms of food for plants. So in horticulture and greenhouse, a lot of times when we talk about potting media that we're using to grow in a commercial setting, we talk about it having a starter charge. So a starter charge means that when they prepared that mix before they bagged it up, they put it in a mixer and they added some fertilizer. In some cases, you would prefer it not to have anything in it, but if it's going to go in a container for your annual plants, it's really nice to go ahead and have some fertilizer already mixed in so that plants can have something to eat as soon as you get them in the container.
That's K-State Nursery Crop and Marketing Specialist Cheryl Boyer with information on choosing the best potting media for outdoor use. The articles are in the May 23rd, May 30th, and June 6th weekly horticulture newsletters. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.